Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here, just getting ready for the Outsiders on Sunday, the 19th of November.
Long before the high-profile cases of Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Donald Trump, or Bill Clinton, sexual harassment has always been an uncomfortable subject, not just for the perpetrator and the victim in the spotlight, but for us as society as well. At some point, we would have encountered sexual harassment in our lives, or we would have witnessed it, or perhaps sensed it, but we weren't quite sure whether we perhaps misread the signals. Maybe we didn't realize until much later that our actions could have been construed as being offensive. And always after the incident, there's a feeling of confusion, of helplessness and outrage, even shame, and that makes it difficult to talk about it. But more victims are becoming emboldened to speak out, and as the hashtag #MeToo campaign rolls on with story after uncomfortable story shared, the pattern seems to point to an abuse of power, particularly in the workplace. Well, it's been over 30 years since sexual harassment legislation was introduced in Australia, and yet sexual harassment in the workplace seems to be just as big an issue as it ever was, if not more common. So, are sexual harassment policies and training programs really working? That's our subject today. Please join us if you would like to share your thoughts. Now, joining me today on the panel to discuss the issue is Hayley Cray. She's a partner with Clayton Utz. Peter Wilson is the chairman of the Human Resources Institute and Associate Professor Ray Cooper from the University of Sydney's Business School. Welcome to you all. Thanks. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
If I could start perhaps by let's all agree on a definition of sexual harassment because there's all sorts of interpretation as to what it is. Peter, if I could start with you as the chairman of the Human Resources Institute, what is your definition of sexual harassment?
Yes, it's treatment or conduct in the workplace which diminishes a co-worker because of their gender, basically. And it has light forms and it has extreme forms which have a criminal consequence.
And Hayley, from a legal standpoint, is there a legal definition of sexual harassment?
Yes, of course, there is. It is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, which, depending upon your jurisdiction, is intended to offend, humiliate, etc., or a reasonable person would take it as offending and humiliating.
Ray, what's your take?
I'd say it's unwanted sexual attention, and what's really important is to understand that it's in the eye of the receiver. So it's not in terms of the person who's doing the behaviour. What their perception is of the impact is the impact on the person who receives the behaviour.
But it's quite difficult, isn't it? As you say, it's what the receiver feels. As you say, Ray, if you could just explain this. What do you do then if you feel uncomfortable? If you've said once, twice, 3 times, I'm uncomfortable with this situation or this statement, or what do you do? How do you broach this?
Okay, so you've made it clear that it's unwanted behaviour by broaching it with the person who's undertaking the behaviour. The most policies in workplaces would say speak to somebody, speak to a colleague, speak to your supervisor. If you're not comfortable speaking to the supervisor, or perhaps if it is that person who's undertaking that behaviour, speak to someone else in the workplace and follow the procedure. The problem is that many people don't feel safe and comfortable to follow that procedure. So, and that's an interesting issue in itself.
I want to come back to that. Peter, can I bring you into this discussion? Now, you have described sexual harassment as a corporate cancer. Explain that to us.
Well, because it's untreated and left untreated, it can cause very serious consequences, including through suicide or some other response, so the death of the person that's been the victim. So a cancer because it's been a long-term malaise. It has profound consequences on the culture and conduct in the workplace, and it requires immediate treatment when it's detected, but I'm afraid that doesn't happen often enough.
Now, Hayley, this, of course, all calls into question the effectiveness of human resources policies in organizations. Companies, it seems, have them as legal protection for the companies, I suppose. It helps to minimize their liability for hostile work environment. Or are these policies a real effort to address the corporate cancer, as Peter calls it, affecting the staff?
I think you need to look at it holistically. I mean, realistically, an employer should, for appropriate education and legal defensiveness, have policies, procedures, complaint mechanisms, and training as part of the response that they should be taking to educate and ensure that a workplace has a culture that they would like in terms of freedom from sexual harassment. However, it's what you walk past that you condone that then becomes the very issue I think that Peter is identifying and Professor Ray as well, the circumstances of being able to understand how to make a complaint, how a complaint is treated, and what is not sexual harassment is obviously important and helps understand and deal with those types of behaviours. But how an organisation responds to complaints and how, as you've seen from a lot of the international media on this, the bystander principle of what people actually see and don't complain about is part of the problem of what needs to change in terms of culture.
Now, we're talking about procedures that have been implemented, as Haiti says, Peter as well. But you mentioned a little earlier too about the victims not wanting to come forth. Why? Policies are in place. It's all there to protect them.
Yeah, right. And in organisations, and we've done research on this, in organisations where there are fantastic policies and great procedures that are set out on a website and there's training in place, the problem is it's the behaviour in the workplace, as Haiti says. If employees don't feel safe and if they feel fearful of the consequences of speaking up about sexual harassment, if when they do complain or they see others complain, there is no appropriate action taken that's in line with the severity of the behaviour, if they feel that they're going to be questioned about their part in the activity, where were they, what were they wearing, what did they say, why didn't they speak up earlier, then that absolutely tells people that it's not safe to make a complaint, even when you do have really rigorous policies. And we see this across public sector, private sector, and not-for-profits.
We tend to see the issue from the victim's point of view as we have. Haiti, you've handled many sexual harassment cases. Explain to us, why would anyone want to make unwanted advancements knowing that their position is threatened given the corporate policies that are in place? Is this an abuse of power, whether it be position or gender?
At its core, sexual harassment is an abuse of power. And particularly what you're seeing, the patterns of behaviour, the insidious predatory behaviour, is very much an abuse of power. Why would someone do it? Fundamentally, I think the very core says is they've gotten away with it. I don't know that it necessarily always must start as touching and propositions for sex, which certainly seem to proliferate in the cases, but fundamentally it's those off jokes, the overly familiar language, and the lack of understanding of where that line should be drawn, that very much seems to encourage that culture, which then will develop into a more insidious sexual harassment or predatory behaviour. People know, in training and understanding, you don't need to say what is unacceptable, and you don't need to explain to people, it is inappropriate to touch someone's backside in the workplace. It is inappropriate to touch their breast. Yet we still have people doing those things. Much of it will be linked into alcohol and much of it linked into other personal distress in their lives, which is often a compounding factor in relation to a harasser's explanation of the conduct. But it is the more insidious low-level conduct which gives rise to the development of a culture that can have far broader reaching consequences.
I absolutely agree, and what we know from the prevalence data in terms of how many people are affected by sexual harassment, of the 1/4 of all women who report having been sexually harassed at work, 1/2 of that 1/4 say that they have been subject to the snide jokes, the sexualised language, and that is the most common approach. Now, the issue is that might not seem, in inverted commas, as serious as other forms of behaviour, but it sets the tone for what's acceptable. It sets the tone, especially if peers and more senior people in the organisation are seen to make those kinds of comments and jokes. But if they laugh at them, even, it really sets the culture and the tone around what's acceptable.
Well, some people will say, well, that just brings up the fun police, doesn't it? I mean, if it was just a joke, it does depend on who takes the joke and how they interpret it.
Yeah, I guess. But if the content of a joke is basically about sexual power, I don't know, fun police or not fun police, it's still unacceptable behaviour in the workplace that singles out a particular group.
And if it's objectifying women and denigrating women, and or denigrating personal conduct, male or female, the reality is it's unacceptable for a workplace.
Bring on the fun police.
Peter, yes, I just wanted to ask you, take us through, if you could very briefly, the sort of training that's available at the moment that many companies employ to teach their staff about sexual harassment.
Yes, well, happy to, and a lot of it's ineffective, which is why I'd like to focus on the missing piece to try and get some better traction in this issue. Essentially, most companies will have a diversity and inclusion policy. It'll cover bullying and harassment, and within that, sexual harassment. So you won't get anywhere unless the government, the organisation has said, this is what we stand for. And then a lot of the training is what we well understand as off-the-shelf training. We've all been to courses on a generic subject that aren't that interesting. I'm afraid far too much of the content of training are sessions, perhaps 2 or 3 hours at most, where someone comes in and delivers examples of bad experiences in other places, and people listen and the box is ticked on the hours required and they're gone. That's not going to do very much. Really, the effective training that works are those where some principles are established, and really through a facilitator, people are asked in a confidential environment to come out with instances they've seen in their own workplace of what was spoken about before, what I call ascendant bullying, where some smart remarks are made and then the perpetrator builds up the situation until there's more overt conduct which is totally inappropriate. So bullies do ramp themselves up to a position of power if they're given an opportunity, and getting people to talk about what they've seen in their own workplace, what are some of the thoughts of other co-workers, what have they seen. You get a very localised content discussion going on what's happening around here. It can be non-attributable, and people might realise they've got somebody in their own workplace in mind. And then you talk about ways we can combat that, ways we can defend ourselves and our individual rights to work. Then you get really solid strengths and skills building that help people do 2 things: report the situation to an appropriate authority, or also, with a co-worker, stand up to the perpetrator and tell them to stop at an early stage. That last part is where we're missing out, and I'm afraid a lot of organisations, get the tick from corporate counsel, have the policy, have the off-the-shelf training, and the job's done, let's go back to work, and it's a total waste of time.
I just want to pause here and just read out a text that someone's just sent us. Go to HR, no way. HR in every public sector organization I've worked in is set up to protect the management. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality is, if anything, is wider than 2 decades ago. So there is that disconnect, isn't it? You have the policies, you have the rules and regulations that are in place, but HR doesn't do anything about it. Ray,
I've heard that negative stereotype many times. There are bad practitioners in all professions, including my own, HR. But there are a lot of HR practitioners that are doing good things and understand that they have to defend the rights of the workplace and workers in it, and not just the top bosses, which we've seen examples of in recent times. So yes, that behaviour compounds the problem, and it is evident, but it is not universal. And in fact, I can point to a number of places where good work is being done by HR, but in conjunction with the leadership, because ultimately this issue comes down to the board and the CEO, that the tone is set from the top, and HR and other business leaders facilitate and put that in place. But it's not about one person, it's a collegiate responsibility which starts at the top and must affect the total organisation, and it must have local content to be effective.
Ray, I want to bring you in here. Even if a complaint is made, it still makes the workplace uncomfortable, doesn't it?
Yeah,
and that's why people don't really want to speak up.
So I mean, it's really, at the very least, it's a very awkward situation to be in, and people feel quite ashamed, and there's a whole bunch of personal identity issues in this. So it's a really difficult subject to broach, and in some ways that's one of the reasons why it's really so difficult to deal with, because people don't feel confident to expose themselves, I suppose, to talking about some problems that they've had. They don't feel it's something they want to talk about out loud in a way that they might if they have a more regular injury at work, for example, like a break a finger is very different to, you know, have a really awful.
Because they might be judged.
Yeah, they
one
might
way or
be judged,
another.
and it's really embarrassing. And that's what people talk to us about when we interview them for research. It's not just about the impact that it has upon them, which can be quite profound, but that it's just a very personalised, very shaming thing for the people who are the victims of it.
But at the same time, Haiti, more cases
There we go.
seem to be coming
Upload
to-
limit. Bye.